Welcome. Hey, Cole. Hi, Yuri. Hi, Constantine. Jody. Afros. Joa. Hello, everyone. How's everyone feeling about the homework or the assignment? Yeah, it could be. It's a challenging assignment, but just keep at it. Like the more you do this stuff, the more it's gonna become second nature for you. So if anyone has any kind of questions about the exercise in particular, you can drop them in the Q&A function. And in the meantime, I'm going to hang around and kind of just wait for people to come in. But it's good to see you all again. I hope you had a nice weekend. I had an okay weekend. Didn't really do too much, which is like, sometimes those are the best ones. And then once we get started, we'll go through the exercise too. Yeah, Akil, I'll definitely talk about that. So I know there was some confusion about whether or not the two exercises were connected. I definitely intended them to be connected. So sorry that wasn't clear. I hope that my clarification this morning helped. But the goal is definitely that exercise 1 is creating contact, or sorry, exercise 2 is creating contacts. I also got some nice messages from people saying that now they understand the power of classes. And yeah, I mean, classes are kind of like the best, you know, like when you first hear about them, it can be like, why would we want that concept? But then once you start to work with them, you kind of see how nice the code ends up being. You can think if we didn't have something like classes, it'd be really complicated to implement this exercise because we would have to create like a global variable that everything referenced. We'd have to create some kind of structure to organize the code. The classes really wrap everything up so that it is really nice. Okay, so we'll definitely get to connecting them. Same, Greg, I'll in a minute get to that. Anonymous Attendee says, this is my first day here. Is it possible for me to receive the assignments from last week? Yes, it is possible to receive the assignments. I don't know the best way to do that. I think the best way would probably be for me to send you a list of all the videos. And they're also in Slack. So if you get on the Slack, maybe someone can drop the Slack link here. That would be helpful. Also, anyone that's typing in chat, if you switch your to should be set to panelists and attendees. Otherwise, you're just sending it to me, which I'm still happy to receive them. But if you want other people to see them, you have to change it. Okay, Constantine says, is there a specific naming convention used mainly in Ruby? I will talk about that a bit, but the answer is what I'm doing, which is called snake case, or at least that's what people have started referring to it as, but it's basically lowercase letters with underscores between the words. Okay, Joe says, is using a class within a class considered nesting? So what you will call that, it's called nested classes, but it is not necessarily super useful. It's like, it's just the ability to kind of logically put one class inside of another. We're probably not going to cover it in this course, but it is called nesting classes. And they work just like regular classes. There's nothing different about them. The lowercase with underscores is referred to as snake case. Like I don't know why, actually. I mean, like it looks kind of like a snake, I guess, because it goes in a straight line with like little lumps. I tried to look up why it was called snake case the other day, and it's just a term that someone created, I think in like 2012 or something. So sorry, that's not more meaningful of an answer, but that's where it came from. It could be mice inside of it. Maybe that's where the lumps come from. Okay. Take a second to fix this. Okay, here we are, exercise 4. So the first thing that we want, and feel free to drop questions in the Q&A again while I'm going through this. And then we're going to cover, I have a whole bunch of other stuff that I want to cover that are kind of looping back on this. So there's a bunch of things that I want to make sure to cover about the exercise. But first, I'm going to start by just doing it. So first, create a class that represents a contact. So let's go over into our editor. So we want to create a class that represents a contact. And it looks like we are saying that contacts have names and numbers. So the easiest way is class contact. And it says that it's going to take an initializer. I am going to fix my spaces too, because it annoys me. 2. Okay, so it takes an initializer, name, and number. Okay, so that's the basic contact. Now in this step, it doesn't say to do anything with them. So I'm not going to do anything with them right away, but we'll start by just taking them in. So the way that you would use this, again, is contact.new. You say John, and you say 555555555. I noticed that some people wanted to store the phone numbers as numbers. While I agree that that would be nice, there are some problems with that. So one problem is that some numbers start with 0. And I think that some people ran into this. So if a number starts with 0, what's going to happen is it's going to get turned into binary. But even actually, if it didn't get turned into binary, there's still a problem, because when numbers get processed in Ruby, anything with a 0 would get removed, right? Because the things at the beginning of any number get removed, because that's just, if I wrote 00001, these are not significant digits, so they get removed no matter what. So it's a lossy thing. You can't use a number to represent a phone number, at least if you're trying to represent a global phone number. Okay, so if I run this, nothing happens. There's no output, and that is to be expected because didn't do anything inside the initializer. But it is nice that it didn't error. So the next thing is create a dial method. Sorry. So create a dial method on contact that will output the name and number of the person being dialed. Okay, we can do that. So dial is going to be a method. Dial doesn't have to take in any arguments because everything that it needs probably should already be here. So we'll do something like puts dialing name at number. Now, probably a couple of you are screaming because there is no name. Name here would be a local. So in order to reference name, we need to somehow store it on the class and then be able to pull it back out. So the way that we store it, remember, is at and then a thing to create what is called an instance variable. We'll do the same for number. And then once we've done that, you can think of the at as making it available anywhere inside of an instance. So now we can actually access it in here as well. So I'm going to take my contact. I'm going to put that into a new local called contact. And then let's just dial the contact. So if I run this, you'll see dialing John at 555, 555, whatever. Does this make sense? So again, our initializer takes in the things, stores them on the instance, and all our dial method is take them off the instance and output them using puts. When we go create a contact, we have to use contact.new because that's how you that's how you turn a class into an object. You make a new one of it. Remember, classes are the definition of what a contact means, and .new creates an actual one. We pass in some things, and then we call contact.dial, which has the kind of end result of calling this method, which outputs dialing John at and then phone number. Are there any questions on this part? Okay. Now we're going to move to exercise 2. So in exercise 2, we're going to create a second class phone to represent a phone. I'm guessing this is where all the questions are. So class phone. Okay. And then we want to implement add contact, which is going to take in a name and number and place the number into a hash by name. Okay, we can do that. So I saw some of you call that hash phone book. It's really smart. That's exactly what it is. So the hash itself, you can think of as the phone book. It's the way that you look up a phone number. Then we're going to have add contact, which takes in a name and a number. And when we store it, we could store it like this. We could store it as phone book of name equals number. So what's nice about that is that's going to allow us to look up by name, and it's going to give us the number. But one thing that's not nice about that is that to dial the number is not straightforward because we have this number. To get to this method is not easy. So we would end up implementing dial again down here. So we don't want to do that. So what we'll do instead is we'll do contact.new name number. So what this is saying is put something in the phone book, key by name, and the value should be a new contact with the name and the number. So really the phone book here is just an easy way to look up a contact by name. I'm not seeing a lot of chat today, and I'm guessing it's because, okay. Taking notes, like it. Okay, so I'm going to answer a couple questions. Sarah says, does it matter that the name is in square braces? So I guess you're talking about this here, and it has to be because there's no other way to make it work. So if it wasn't in square braces, it wouldn't work. If it was just name, it also wouldn't work. And the reason it wouldn't work is because if you do just this, it's going to store it into a local variable. But what you want to do is store it as a value inside of the hash. Remember, this hash is going to be essentially John to contact of John and 5555555. This is the mapping. The key is John, the value is contact. Okay, so the code here should be phone book of name. Also important here that I know a couple of you did this. Name here should not be in quotes. And I'll show you in a second why it can't be in quotes. Okay, next question is, why doesn't it work for me when I put the arguments in the function call with brackets? I don't know offhand, but if you send the example or you put it in Slack, hopefully someone can help you out. These don't need to be in any kind of parentheses. So, okay, the next question is, what about the dial part in number 2? I will get there just in 1 second. The next is, do you always have to initialize your classes? The answer is no. You don't have to initialize your classes, but in both of these cases, we need some initialization behavior. So in the first one, we need to be able to hold on to the name and number that were passed in so we can keep them around so that we can use them later in the dial method. And in this case, we need to have an empty phone book because you can't put something into an empty phone book. There are other ways to write this line, but that you would not need an initializer, but the easiest way by far is to have the initializer. The next is, does phone book need to be inside initialize? Could it be inside of add contact? It can be inside of add contact, but you need a way. So imagine I did this, phone book equals this. I'm going to show you why it needs to be an initializer. So imagine I change it to that. The problem is that every time you add a contact, you'll be erasing your entire phone book. So you would need some way here to say only do this if there is no phone book already. So the easier way is just to put it inside the initializer. Then you make sure that you're not erasing it every time. So Andrea, I think I did your same comment. Someone asked if I could use hash.new. Yeah, hash.new is the same thing as doing this empty square brace thing. So you could use that just in case, or just the same. What does the empty brackets inside the phone class mean? So are you talking about these two maybe? What that means is new hash, to create a new hash. Someone says when they call contact new, it doesn't work, but contact.new name number works. Yeah, it's because you have a space in between new and the parentheses. And if you introduce a space here, then what you're actually saying is contact.new, pass it one argument, which is the result of name, comma, number. There should not be a space in here at all. You need to be right up against it. And the reason it works if you take the parentheses away is that then it's essentially putting the parentheses in the same spot that they should be. Okay, so the last part of the exercise is dial, which takes in a name and finds the contact, calling dial on it once found. So let's do it. Let's make a phone. And then we'll do phone, add contact. We'll pass John, and we'll pass 555, 555, 5555. And then we'll do phone.dial. Let's run that and see what happens. Yeah. Okay, so he says undefined method dial for phone. So we have to go implement the method dial, and all it should do is it should take in a name, and it should do phone book of name dot dial. We run that. Sorry, this has to take in a name. So now you can see that it's working. Erica, we'll cover inheritance later today. Yeah, good question. So Olaweson says, what happens if not found? Let's try it out. Phone.dial, Kate. Okay, so we have an error. And some of you accounted for this in your examples. Good job. So how do we fix this error? The first is that we can take this and we can actually put phone book of name into a variable. Now, pretty obvious, we should call that contact, but you could call it anything you want. Contact is just the easiest because that's what we know the values inside of the phone book hash are. So we could call contact.dial. So now the bug is still there. But now what we've done is we've given ourselves a chance to fix it. So we can do contact.dial if contact. Run that. Now it works. And if you want, you could even write something like this. You could say if contact, else if there is a contact, dial it. Otherwise, puts no such contact name. want to talk a little bit about a couple of things. So I'm gonna, while people continue to have questions or drop questions in, I'm going to start just going through a couple of things that I saw pretty often, just so that people are aware to not do them. So one is a style thing, which is that I saw a lot of people writing their if clauses like this. Now you can do this, it'll work, but in Ruby, you don't do it. So there should not be a parenthesis around the arguments of an if statement. So you can just leave it like this, and then it will look more like what people expect Ruby to be. The next one is your variable names. So notice how I'm calling it add_contact, and I'm calling it phone_book. This is, we're calling it snake case, but the idea is that this is how you should name your instance variables, local variables, and methods. Your classes should be named with a capital leading letter. And if there are multiple words, they should have phone, book, both capitalized. Okay. The next is, I showed you this. So imagine we didn't have the else here, we just had this. I showed you this, if contact, contact.dial. There's actually another way to write this that you'll see fairly often. I'm going to show you. If you don't get this part, it's okay. You can obviously look it up if you ever need it again. But if you write this, this is the same thing as this. So what it means is go to contact, and if contact is not nil, call dial on it. So just because you might see it, there's this format that is the equivalent of if not contact.nil, contact.dial. Now, anyone that has like a background, for example, in PHP, this is not the same as the @ sign. It's not the same thing, meaning like this is not hiding errors. It's not saying if the method isn't defined, then don't call this thing. All it is doing is if contact is not nil, contact.dial. Okay. Another thing I saw pretty often was an unnecessary use of ibars. So here, what you could do is you take in name and number. I saw some people do things like this. Now, this will work, but a problem with this code is that while it will work, it will also pollute the instance variables of the phone class. So even though it doesn't really matter, if you call add contact multiple times, each time you're going to leave behind the most recently added number in this instance variable. So it's better just to not, and it's less code, so you don't have to do that. Another thing I saw was people doing this. While I understand why you would write this, because it looks like what you would write in a different language, the way that you should actually write this in Ruby is with the trailing if. So if you write code like this, then people are going to know that you're coming from a different language. Just in Ruby, you write with the trailing if. Another thing I want to talk about is testing. So the best way to like know that you have something right is to test it. And we'll talk at some point in this course, we'll talk about actual testing. But the best way you can do actual testing now is you can exercise some cases down here. For example, anyone that did @phonebook equals hash in here, if you did this, you could have found it by doing something like this. You add a contact called John, you try to call a contact named Kate, you add a contact named Felipe, and then you dial John, and then you dial Felipe. This is like you're thinking of all the cases where your code could have trouble, and you're exercising them. And then the last thing I'll mention on this before I go back to the questions is just why. I know some people had trouble with the binary thing. So imagine they had a number like that started like this. I think this was the one that came up, and they were outputting 5. The reason you're getting 5 is that Ruby's trying, if Ruby sees a leading 0 on a number, because you should never have to put a leading 0 in. So if you type a leading 0 into the editor, Ruby's going to assume that you want it to evaluate the rest of the thing as binary. 0101 is 5 in binary. So if people are interested in why it's 5 in binary, we can talk about that after the course. But if you had trouble with numbers and you saw weird output, that is why it happened. Okay, I'm going to take some questions and then we'll keep going. If contact also tests for nil. So yeah, the question here is say contact equals 5. You do if contact. So we hadn't actually seen this before. But I want you to read this as is, okay, first let me tell you what an if does. An if tests for false or nil. We call these things falsy values. Okay, so only these two values are considered true, sorry, are considered falsy. So if you do if contact, that's the equivalent of saying if contact is true or contact is not nil. Sorry, if contact not equal to false and this is the equivalent. It's saying if contact is not as false and if contact is not nil. So that's, you can shorten that to just if contact. So if you know that something, if you know that a value is not holding a Boolean always, then you can use if contact to essentially mean is the thing defined. Next question is what does if contact.dial mean? Yeah, so the reason we wrote if contact.dial is because if you pass a name to the phone class that it doesn't know, I can just show you what happens again. So if I save it like this, you'll see an error that says undefined method dial for nil class. And the reason you're seeing that is because it's trying to look up the contact, but there is no contact. So contact becomes nil. And then you're trying to call nil.dial, which is not going to work because nil class does not have a dial method. So the if contact says call the dial method if there is a contact found. Using pieces that we've already learned before, it's the equivalent of this. Contact is at phone book name, dial the contact if the contact is not nil. Actually, a fun place to show you that you can also, if you're writing if not something, you can just write unless. So contact.dial unless the contact is nil. And this goes back to the Ruby being readable piece. Hopefully that makes sense. I mean, you can just read it out loud. Dial the contact unless contact is nil. So for add contact, the hash is created with only a name and number and not two names. Yes, the intention of add contact is that you would put a name and a number in to add them to your phone book in the phone. Next question is, how does at phone book of name.dial reference the contact.dial method? Yeah, talk about that. I think I broke that down a little bit by splitting these out into two separate things to illustrate a little bit, but at phone book of name returns an instance contact. So then when you call contact.dial, you're actually calling this dial method up here. And can you do a one line if else or just if? If you can ask that again at the end of the course, or if you want to search it on your own, it's called a ternary operator. But generally, you're going to write out your if else statements. Okay. Cool. I think we're out of questions now. So first, I'm going to just inform you all that this is our last day of pure Ruby. So after this, things are, I wouldn't say going to get harder, but they are going to change quite a bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about Ruby today, and then we're going to just go straight off the deep end into Rails. So look forward to learning about Rails tomorrow. Also, I want to share that we have a very, very special guest tomorrow joining us. So if you all can be, relatively on time, it should not disappoint. It's going to be awesome. Okay, I'm going to take a question because it's in here. So Ruben says, dial method in phone class. What if it doesn't take a name as an argument and takes the name from the instance? It can't, because the dial method in phone class, remember, phones don't have any idea of what a name is, right? Phones only have a phone book. A phone book is a mapping of name to contact. So initialize can't, dial cannot assume what the name is, because remember, a phone, like the one you would hold in your hand, has multiple contacts. So if it assumed what the name was, then it would be a phone that could only store one contact, which essentially is just the contact class. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Is everyone ready to learn more new things? Okay. I know it's a lot, so like, it's just going to keep coming. It's going to keep coming, and then all of a sudden we're going to be at the end of the course, and you're going to know all the things. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is, you've probably seen a few times now, and again, as I'm going, if anyone has questions, drop them in. It can help me make sure that I don't miss anything, but you're going to get there, Cole, don't worry. So if I have something like contact, and it takes an initializer, which takes a name, let's say it's just the name for now, and it's at name equals name. Now, if I make a new contact, let's say I make a contact like this, and then I want to output the name. Okay, let's do it. Let's run this, and it's going to error. It's going to error because there's undefined method name for contact. So the way that I've taught you to solve this is that you make a def name, at name, end. And this is like, I don't know, pretty simple to understand. It's a method called name that just happens to return the value of an instance variable with the same name. And this is such a common pattern in Ruby and all programming languages that Ruby actually has a special way to do this. Yes, it's in order to access at name, the value of the instance variable name outside of the class, which normally you would not be able to do. So the way that Ruby has built in to do this is a thing called attr_reader. Okay, so this line here, number 4, is the same as lines 10 through 12. So what attr_reader means, it is a method that you call, which I'll talk about that in a second too, because that's super interesting. And you pass it the symbol and then the name of the instance variable. And then what it'll do is it'll automatically define def name, at name, end. Okay. So just to prove to you that this works, we'll run it, and it outputs my name. You're probably guessing, and you would be right, that there's also one called attr_writer. So now I can actually do contact.name equals Kate plus contact.name. And that works too. So I didn't have to go write any kind of a setter or anything. I didn't have to do that. Now, I may have just glossed over something, which is pretty important. So I'm going to spend some time particularly focusing on this, because I think it is a very important thing, which is that notice that what I'm doing here is I'm doing contact.name equals Kate. So if you're from any other language, this is going to seem super weird to you. You can't contact.name equals Kate, I even see the comments coming in where people are saying, is this maybe talking about, is this an attribute? And yes, adder stands for attribute. That's how you should remember it. But these are not contact.name equals Kate. Makes you wonder if adder reader is the same as def name at name end. If these are the same, what is the equivalent of adder writer name? And this is where things get a little crazy because the equivalent of adder writer name is this. So in Ruby, if you define a method that ends in an equal sign, you're actually able to define what happens when you do the name of the method equals something. You can custom define the behavior of assignment in Ruby. So the equivalent of adder reader, I know. I know. If you think it's crazy, you think it's too powerful, you're going to see when we head into Rails just how amazingly nice it is when you go to use some APIs that are, sorry, some classes that have been written like this. So just for now, remember that adder reader is the equivalent of a method that defines the same name instance variable. And adder writer is a method that defines an equals version that takes in a name and assigns that to at name equal name. So it assigns it to at instance variable of the same name. And if you don't believe that this works, I'm going to do a quick example because I think it is just that interesting. I'm going to make it so that when you set name to something, it actually sets the name on the instance variable to the inverse of the name that you set, the reverse of it. So the same way in other variables that you would write something like set name of name, Ruby's equivalent is to just override assignment on the property. So def name equals no set name. I'm like slowing down here because I realize that this is confusing. So okay, someone ND has asked, does calling adder writer without adder reader just work, or do you need to call adder reader as well as adder writer to use the attributes? If you want to use both of them, then you have to call both of them. So they're independent of each other. There's actually a way to solve that, which is that if you have adder reader like this, and right underneath it, you also have adder writer. And you want to maybe have that for multiple parameters. So you have it for name and you have it for number, for example. You can shorten this by saying adder accessor. Okay. So adder accessor, think of it as adder reader and adder writer, does all of it. So if you write adder accessor of name, that is the equivalent of writing all of this is this. Yeah, so Luis, a method called setName is like adder writer. The only difference is that the way that you normally do this in Ruby is with the name equals version. So setName will absolutely work. But what I'm trying to prepare you for is you're going into a junior engineering role, or you're getting your first role in Ruby if you've already done development in the past. We need you to be writing Ruby code like a Rubyist writes Ruby code, so that the things that you're learning are more valuable, and people aren't maybe going on your pull requests and saying things like, this isn't how you write Ruby, or this, you're writing Ruby like a JavaScript developer would write Ruby or something. Yeah, Ruben, I understand the desire to want to use different names. I will try to use a different name than name, but it is very important that this name and this name are the same thing, because that is what is happening when you call adder access or adder reader or adder writer. Okay, next is I ran the code and I got a syntax error, unexpected equals. Yeah, again, there needs to be no space between the name and the equal sign. So if you write something like this, Ruby's going to see this as like an assignment or something, and it's not going to work. There needs to be no space. The next is, what's the difference between adder writer and reader? So the difference is that adder reader defines a method called, if you had an instance of contact, you get the name out of it. And adder writer name does this, set something into it. So they just do not the same thing. The next is adder accessor dependent on the declaration of the initialize method. No, it's not. So if you did not have this initializer method, and then you would not be able to write this anymore, it's still going to work. So by default, the value is going to be nil when you do contact.name. So you see no output here. And then when you've set the name, you get the right name out. And the last question, or next question, is adder accessor does all the jobs of getter and setter? Wow. Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, like in other programming languages, this would be a lot of work. So yeah, it does all of it. It's awesome. And you're going to see it all over Ruby code. Andrew says, can you explain what def name equals name method does and how it's useful? Yeah, I will. Okay, so imagine you had a dog. No, I'm going to try to do something that doesn't involve the word name. So imagine you had a computer class. So you had a class representing a computer. Okay, the computer is going to exist in the world. So you say computer equals computer.new, and you want to output the computer's host name. So I'll have an adder reader for host name. Now imagine you wanted to be able to set the host name after the computer is created. If you wanted to be able to set the host name after it was created, let's say I run this, it's going to say undefined method hostname equals for computer. And what it's telling you is that you haven't defined a setter for hostname. So you could use adder writer, or you could do hostname equals hostname. Hostname equals hostname. So now you're reading this, you're probably saying, John, this is ridiculous. Like, you wrote hostname 4 times on one line. Why? And why would you ever want to define your own custom setter? So I'll tell you a couple reasons. First, I'll tell you that this internal variable as the argument does not need to be called hostname. It can be called anything you want. So I'll call it HN instead. The second is that this actually doesn't even need to be called hostname either, although you want this name to line up with the adder reader. And then as far as the why, it's because you might want to do something like return if hostname is localhost. So now this is a setter that sets the host name, say like set the host name as long as the host name is not localhost. Okay. So the reason you might want to make a custom one with your own name is because you want it have custom behavior inside of it. Okay, the next thing, it could go either way. It's just a fake example. So it could be either not equals or equals. But in this case, I think you would want to say like return if host name equals localhost, because you're saying, I don't want to set it if it is localhost. So this is like a guard. That's what we normally refer to single lines like this as a guard. It's saying, if it's host name, just return, don't do anything. So I hope that answers your question. Okay. Now I want to talk about method visibility. So method visibility is a way to take certain methods and make them so that they are not accessible outside the class. And you're probably wondering, but John, you just spent all this time telling me how to get methods accessible outside the class. Why would we want to make methods not accessible outside the class? So when we have a class, sometimes there's some internal behavior that's fairly complicated. So imagine I wanted to write a, you just spent all that time, a Pig Latin translator. I'm not going to write a full Pig Latin translator, although if you're interested in doing something like this, you can. So imagine that I could take a Pig Latin translator and I could maybe take in a word. And I want to do something like if word, what is the rules of Pig Latin? So I have hello, which I want to turn into elohe. So I want to do something like take the first letter, then I want to take the rest. Then I want to take the first and I want to add it to the rest. Then I want to add a on the end. So let's try this out. This is kind of the weakest Pig Latin translator ever, but maybe we can make it work. .new John, or say it, what's a good one? Hello. Right, sorry, rest plus first. .new, and then we want to call that translator, and then we want to puts translator.word. Okay, so I'll need to set word equal to that, and then I'll need to put an outer reader for word. So hopefully we're all at the point where this makes sense. This code makes sense. I'm taking a class. And keep in mind, this could just be a method. I realize it's not a very long example, but we're taking a class, we're putting in a word, getting a translator, and then calling word on it to get the translated word back out. Okay. Now, it's fine because it's only 3 lines, but imagine if this was more complicated. Imagine if we wanted to be able to, instead of writing it like this, first plus rest plus first plus a, we wanted to be able to take this logic and maybe make it more complicated or make the different methods more complicated, which you would have to do if you made a real Pig Latin translator. So what you can do is you can go define a method called rest, and you can find a method called first. And I'm gonna do a refactor real quick to show you what that would look like. Okay, and then rest would be this. Okay, and then at word, instead of that, we could define a method called word, and it would just have the value of rest plus first plus a. Okay, so what did I do there? Now I'm taking the word in and I'm storing it in an instance variable. So this is just a different implementation of the exact same thing that I just wrote. I'm putting word into an instance variable called word. Then I'm defining that public method word to be equal to rest plus first plus a. Notice when I call rest, I'm calling this method here. I call first, I'm calling this method here. And if I run it, it will break. And it's going to break because these are needing to have at on them. Okay, so if I run it, you're going to see what happens. It's the exact same thing. It's the exact same code. Now, does anyone know what the problem is with the code? It's long. Yeah, the problem is that if I go down here and I do puts translator dot rest and I run it, it says hello, or sorry, LO. Now, that's probably fine. I don't think that anyone's like gonna worry about whether or not rest can be called. But imagine if it was something more more important. So something like a car, and the car has things you make happen and things that it internally has to be able to do. For example, I need to step on the gas pedal. When I step on the gas pedal, the fuel pump needs to get more electricity to pump more fuel into the engine. That's not something I have to know about when I'm driving the car. All I have to know about is that I can step on the gas pedal. So if we had a car object, turn on the fuel pump is something that we would not want the car object to be able to let the outside world do. Like, it'd be crazy if you got in your car and you were like, turn on the fuel pump. Like, that's just not something you do. So because of that, Ruby has a thing called method visibility. And the one that I'm going to teach you is the word private. So when I write private here, I'm going to run it again. And now what it says private method rest called for Pig Latin translator. So it's still acknowledging that the method exists, but it's not letting the outside world call it. And this is how you keep things hidden from the rest of your code. It's important to only expose the parts of your code that you actually want the outside world to know about. So we will, when we cover Rails, we will be talking about this a lot. So if this method visibility thing doesn't make sense, that's okay. What's more important is that you know that it exists. So when you see it, you can figure out what it means. It's going to be very obvious when you see it used. But what it means is that anything below this line is private. So in other programming languages, when you have to write private before every one, not in Ruby. Anything from here down. Okay, any questions about method visibility? So Jody asked, would you put public when you want to end the private code? That's a good question. You can do that, but the convention is just to keep all of your private code at the bottom. So typically you're writing private once and you're putting everything private below it. And then anything above the private line is considered to be public because public is the default visibility. So just write private once and everything goes at the bottom. And because of that, you basically never have to write the word public ever. Felipe, private ends at the end of the class declaration. So here, or it ends when, like Jody was saying, it ends when you say public and start to do methods again. But you don't have to do that. Just put your private methods at the bottom. Abdul, if you're interested in information about protected, you can Google it. I just won't be covering it here. So ND, to answer your question, there are not any other conventions for ordering methods, except when we get into class methods, which will involve essentially putting your class methods in above your instance methods. So. Okay. Now I'm going to talk, actually, we're at break time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay here because that seems to be what I what we're settled on. So this 10 minutes is like, I'm not going to cover new material for the next 10 minutes, but if people have questions, you can drop them in the Q&A and I'll continue to answer them. So Ruel, private goes through the bottom or until you say public. So you can read it as private until I say otherwise. You'll also see some people will take this private and they'll dedent it. It's fine. I prefer not to. So you can do it if you want. Okay, Arbreso says private methods are not accessible outside the class, but they are accessible from other methods inside the class. Yes, that's right. Private methods are accessible inside the class. They're accessible in the initializer. They're accessible in other methods. They are just not accessible outside the class. Yeah, Ernest asked how many people reported to class today. There were 112 people reported to class today. So we're continuing our, normal, as far as everything I've read, decline. And I don't know, it feels pretty healthy to me. The people that are leaving class are not people that were maybe like the most engaged. They're people that maybe decided the class wasn't for them, which is fine. It's okay. I mean, of course, I want to have as many people succeed as possible, but I think it was helpful to like read the numbers early on so that I am not sitting here like upset every single time that someone leaves. So Paul Senior says, I tried writing the homework assignment with Addat Reader. Is that okay? Can you demo? Are people interested in seeing that? I can definitely do that. Okay, let's do it. Okay, so we're gonna do the homework assignment. So we have a class called contact. Contact takes in an initializer, name number. It does at name equals name, at number is number. And it's got dial, says puts hi, name, at name. I'm writing it out real quick so that we can get, so that we can write the thing. Add contact name number. And this takes in hash. Let's say hash equals that. And then it's at hash of name equals contact.new name number. And then there's dial, which is hash of name dot dial. I think I got it right. Okay, so if I wanted to use Addat Reader, where could I use Addat Reader? One is that contact, it probably would make sense for the outside world to be able to access the name and number of a contact. So if I were to do something like Addat Reader here, what does that mean? So I've added two methods, but I actually get the ability to remove this at sign too. So optionally can remove that at sign. Well, that's not very compelling. Where else could I use? I guess I'm interested to know, Paul, where you went to use these methods. So if you can write that in the chat, I'll continue to address it in a second. Anonymous attendee says, what do you recommend if you're having trouble understanding and got behind? I would say go back and watch the recordings. I put the recordings out right after each of the episodes and they're there for you to watch them. So I would watch them again, try to follow along, do the exercises from the past classes. Rajesh says, can we have private instance variables? Is that the same as not writing Addat Reader? Yes, that's correct. So for example, here is an instance variable. Instance variables are private. So there is no such thing as a public instance variable or a private instance variable, like there might be in Java, for example. Here, there's only one type. It's always private. They're hidden inside. No other outside thing is supposed to be able to touch them. So Paul Senior is talking about this exercise and says, I was taking variables from contact and putting them in phone. I don't quite know. I think like contact needs to be past the name and the number. So you could potentially write this as this. Contact.name equals contact. I don't know if that makes it clearer, but you can do that. But I think any kind of variables going backwards from contact to phone is probably not going to get you the right answer, or is going to have some kind of an edge case. I will try to look up your example now, though, so that I can more directly talk about the thing. Add a reader name. Yeah, I think okay. I'm looking at your example now. One problem is if you're trying to take the instance variables in add contact out of a contact, but the problem is you don't have a reference to a contact at that point. So if you try to do something like contact.name in here instead of this, you can't, because there is no contact. There needs to be a local variable called contact. So in order for there to be one, you have to essentially look one up in the hash, something like by name, and then you can use whatever you want on it. So I think that answers your question. Also, your values in the hash should, if something starts with an @ sign, it needs to not be in a string inside of quotes. So if you have something like that, it's not going to do anything. This is just, well, I'll even show you. If I do puts @ hash, all that's going to do is output @ hash. So you need to not have the quotes. John, can you please touch on blocks? I noticed that Ruby has a lot of blocks. Yeah, if you have a particular question about blocks, I'm happy to answer it. I know blocks can be pretty confusing, and Rails uses a ton of blocks. So we will be seeing a lot more of blocks. Okay, the next question is, so the add a reader is making the instance variable public. Kind of, but not really. So what the adder reader is doing is it's doing, okay, I'm not going to call it name. I'm going to call it color. So what it's doing is this. You can think of it like making the instance variable public, but what it's actually doing is it's defining a method that gives the outside world access to the instance variable. So it's not really making it public as much as it's just defining a method that returns it. So you can think of it literally like this: def color, return color. This is what's happening when you do add a reader. So it's not making something public. There's no such thing, again, as a public instance variable. All it's doing is making a method that returns the instance variable. Caitlin says, feel free to skip. Question about last Wednesday's assignment. How do you decide using a map, dot map, and a do loop? So I'm guessing what you're asking is the difference between a dot map, array dot map do item and array dot map item. Is this right? I hope this is right. The only way you decide is they're exactly the same, and you decide based on how much you have to write. So if the thing you want to write inside the map is multiple lines, just use this form. And if the thing you want to write is not multiple lines, use this. Actually, a pro tip for those looking for a little bit more is there's actually another way that you can write this. If the thing inside of here, let's say you're writing this. This is a pretty common pattern. You want to call the same method on all the things. You can actually write this as literally no one. I'm only saying this because we're on a break, but you can write this like this, and we'll understand that when we talk more about blocks when we're into Rails, but really do not need to know that right now. Are there specific use cases for return in methods since Ruby has implicit return? That is a fantastic question and one that I think confuses a lot of people. I'm not saying don't write return. What I'm saying is if the return is somewhere where the return would have been implicit anyway, then you don't have to write it. So let's say you're writing something like def name, name capitalize. And what you want the method to do is you want to say, if name is John, return John, else name capitalize. Capitalize. Okay, so imagine I had this code. If the name is John, capitalize it and put an exclamation point at the end. Otherwise, just capitalize it. Another way that you could write this is you could write so now that I've restructured this code does the same thing. And the reason it does the same thing is you can think, because in the if I'm returning, that means that technically anything that doesn't follow that if is the else case. So this is a case where I would write a hard return, and you have to write a hard return in this case because you need to essentially escape the rest of the method. So there are cases for writing a hard return, but for the most part, you will never have to do that because the implicit return will be what you want. Even would write it like this because it reads cleaner. It's easier to read. So it's up to you the way you write it, but know that you do not. There are cases where you need return. They're not going to happen very often. Okay. Welcome back. So now we are going to talk about class methods. We have to talk about class methods because I need you to understand what is happening when we start going into Rails, and Rails uses a lot of class methods. Okay, so we've learned about instance methods. If I have a class called car, I can say I want a method called vroom. Maybe it even has an exclamation point on the end, and it does something. So then when I create a Lambo, that's a new car, and I do lambo.vroom and run that. Sorry, lambo.vroom and run that, and I get vroom vroom. Now, this works fine for behaviors that are talking about a specific car, meaning this is implemented on the object car. So I create a new car instance, I call it Lambo, and then I call vroom on Lambo. But sometimes it's helpful to have a method that is called on the definition of car. Okay, so an example of what might be an instance method for a car is I want to do something like car dot compute global emissions. So the reason that this is on the class instead of on an instance is because it's not about one car. It's about cars, the definition of cars. So sometimes you'll have a method like this that is about the definition and not about the thing. And when you have one of those methods that is about the definition and not the thing, that is called a class method. So I run this, it's going to say undefined method, compute global emissions for car class. Okay. Now I want you to compare that to what it would be if I wrote it, if I tried to call it on an instance. It says undefined method, compute global emissions for car, and then it's got all these crazy letters afterward. Whenever you see a string of crazy letters like this and it says no method error, what it's saying is an instance of car. Okay, so if I change it back to the class, you'll see that it doesn't quite look like that. It's actually saying, well, that's unexpected. It's actually saying the undefined method on car, the class, meaning on the definition car. So how do we define one? So if we do compute global emissions like this, Now, that doesn't look any different from that. So there's nothing separating it apart. They look exactly the same. So we have to do something different. The thing we do different is we write self dot. So what self dot does is it says when I'm defining this method, instead of defining it on an instance, define it on self. Self is just a handy way to talk about the class that you're currently defining, which in this case is car. So if I put something in here, you can see if it works. Computing. Cool. So that is a class method. Sometimes you'll even have the, imagine we wanted to really compute global emissions. So we might want to do something like return the total emissions. So what have I done here? Now I'm using an instance variable inside of a class method. So you can do that, except when you do that, this at total emissions is no longer an instance variable. Now it's what's called class variable. Okay. So you have total emissions, the class variable. And if I run it, you'll see it outputs nothing. And the reason is because total emissions current value is nil. I really don't want to lose you. I want everyone to stay with me. I want you to think of the world as having two buckets. I want you to think of the world as having like this. We talked about how car has these things called instance methods and essentially instance properties or instance variables. And that is true. There's actually also an area down here at the bottom. You can think of like car as divided into essentially two boxes. So something like this. And in this area down at the bottom, there are the class methods. And class variables. So there's a bucket of things related to the instance, and there's a bucket of things related to the class. They're completely independent of each other. So if it starts with self dot, everything inside of it is talking about a class version of the thing. And if you're in one of these, then everything in it is talking about the instance version of the thing. Now you're probably noticing, or maybe noticing, that when I call car.compute global emissions, that looks a lot like when we called car.new. And the reason it looks the same is because it is the same, because car.new is just the class method. Okay, so when you call car.new, you're actually saying, I want to call the new method on the car class. So hopefully this is going to connect some dots for people that might be wondering, what does the dot mean? The dot means take this thing and call this method on it. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of questions. I'm going to pause here, and then I'm going to continue this example because there's more to talk about here. Okay, so anonymous attendee says, so new is just another class method? Yes, it is. I'm going to show you where it is. Object new, Ruby. So if I go here, you'll see that there is a class method. I think it's on basic object actually. Class method called new. So this is the actual new method in Ruby. All it does is it returns a new object. So new is just another class method. Manon says initialize is a class method. No. And I know that's confusing. And I'm going to try to explain what is going on there. So imagine if I were to tell you how new is implemented, I'm going to try to write in pseudocode, which is, we call it pseudocode when we're just writing some code and it's not ever expected to work. This is how new should work. First, it creates a new object. Then it calls that object's initialize method. So initialize, like we've been saying the entire time, is just a special method with a special name, but it's just an instance method. And you can tell it's an instance method because there's no self dot before it. So create a new object, call the method initialize on that object, and then return it. This is what new does. This is literally how new works. This is, if you looked at the code for new, this is what you're going to see. So initialize is an instance method. New is a class method. Okay. So things like there's so many different things that this means. And we can go through them. We can talk about them at length. So it means that things like methods that you'll see defined at the top of classes are actually so in Rails, for example, a lot of times we'll type something in here at the top of a class. These are just calls to class methods. So we'll get there. We're going to do that, but know that you're going to see these a lot. You're probably not going to define them yourself a lot, but it is important to know what they are when you're using them. Ruben says, so can only do car.total emissions and not lambo.total emissions. Yes, that's correct. You can only do car.compute global emissions. If you do lambo.compute global emissions, you'll get an error. And Sewell says, can we call the total emissions attribute outside of the class method? Well, let's give it a shot. So, nope, we can't. So just like a regular instance variable, these class variables are not available outside of the class. You could make them. You could define a total emissions method that exports the value by doing something like total emissions at total emissions. I've removed the car.new. It was just for an example. I want to show you what you could do with something like this. Imagine every time that we vroom, it's actually going to create emissions, but it's not creating an emissions on this car. We want it to create emissions on the global idea of what a car is. So we can write car.create emissions. Then we could implement that method. And what it could do is if total emissions is nil, set total emissions to 0. And then total emissions equals total emissions plus 1. So what I've done here is I've taken my vroom method and I've made it call the class method create emissions. And then in that create emissions method, I've said, if the total emissions is nil, then make the total emissions equal to 0. So you can put it into some known state and then increment the total emissions by 1. Then when I compute total emissions, it'll actually output a number that is how many individual cars have vroomed. So if I change this to something like, I want you to vroom 7 times, and then I compute the total emissions, we can actually say puts on compute total emissions. You'll see that it outputs 7. Now, what's cool, really cool about that is that if I take a Lambo and then I take I don't know, the VW, VW is a different car object. It also emits emissions. I run it, now you can see a bunch of rooms and 12 total emissions. So we've actually taken all of the emissions on one, all of the emissions on the other, and we've added to them together via their common class methods, notably create emissions and compute global emissions. Okay. It's really cool. I'm going to stop for a bit because I realize that this is a lot. And the next topic I'm going to talk about isn't less. So hopefully this makes sense. This is really the way to think about it. There's two buckets of methods. There's one set of things for the instance, and there's one set of things for the definition. The instance and the definition really are just two of the same kind of thing. Like even this instance, like if I did car instance equals car, I can actually grab a handle on the car definition itself. And now, like from the perspective of this code, it's just another instance. So there's nothing special about class variables or class methods. They're just like normal things, except instead of being defined on an object, instead of every object of a particular class getting them, they are defined on the definition, meaning they're defined on the class car. Olowason says, will adder, accessor, writer, and reader work for class variables? The answer is yes, but just like a lot of things, yes, but I'm not going to cover it here. You can look it up and there's a way to do it. It's just, you're never going to have to do it, or you will have to do it, but by then you're going to be smarter than me. So you can look it up, but there's a way to do it. I just don't want to confuse things by talking about it. Jody says, where does the total emissions +1 come in? Yeah, so the idea is that every time that we vroom, we want to create more emissions. And because we want to create more emissions, we have to essentially increment the number that we already have. So we're taking the amount that we had previously and we're adding 1 to it, and then we're storing that back in the same variable. So it's the same way in the past that we've done things like number equals number +1. This is just an increment operation. Can total emissions save itself so the next time you run the same code is 24 emissions instead of 12? Asks Carmen. No, it can't, because in order for it to save itself, we would need to save it somewhere. So one way that it can save it is, for example, you could open a file and you could put the value into a file, and then the next time that the program runs, you could read out of that file. That's one way you could save it. Another way you could save it, and the way that we're going to see in this course, is you can use a database. So as early as tomorrow, we're going to be looking at databases and using them with Rails so that we can go actually do this. We can go create a something and create something that lasts beyond the cycle of just one run of our program. The next question is, class variables can only be accessed via class methods directly and vice versa. That's correct. Yeah, they're two entirely separate buckets. They can't cross over each other, although there is only way they can cross over each other is something like this. So this is the instance reaching into the class. You cannot go the other way because it doesn't really make sense to go the other way. Meaning, like if you wanted to go from the class into an instance, how would you know which instance to go into? You'd have to somehow be past an instance or something. It doesn't make sense to ever go from class to instance, but it does make sense to go the other way around. And when you have something like car.emissions, if you think it's weird that you have to write car here twice, you can actually instead write self.class. So that what that's saying is my own class call create emissions. Julie J says, do you ever use Addat for class variables and have it declared inside the class at the top? You can. I'm just not going to talk about it here. But if you want to, if you're interested in Addat variables, I recommend taking some time to look them up, which is not very often used in Rails. And again, they're used by people that are writing library code or something like that, not by individual developers for the most part. Julianne says, so if two instances call the vroom method, does the global emission increase twice? Yeah, it does. So that's what we did here is we created a Lambo car and we called vroom 7 times on it. And then we created a VW car and we called it 5 times. And you can see the total emissions are 12. No problem. Happy to help. Okay, we're going to go to the next topic. And I realized that this is another big one. We're covering a lot of stuff. I don't think that's going to stop, unfortunately. So your goal is to just jam it in, and then we're going to make something with it. And the process of making something with it, the process of using it and doing the exercises and working toward a goal, become more project-based over time, is to just nail in all those fundamentals. So that's what's going to happen over time. The fundamentals are going to get nailed in. So if you're not understanding something right away, do the exercise, keep going with it, ask questions, join the study groups. There's a lot. I'm going to talk a bit here about a thing called inheritance, because we will definitely need it to write any Rails code. So if you come from another language, inheritance is pretty complicated. I'm going to try to simplify inheritance for people that don't know what it is so that we can just use it. Imagine you have a class called an animal. And let's say you have an initialize method where the animal has a name. So now I can do animal.new Sparky. I can do puts animal.name, and then in order to make that work, I would do something like add a reader name. Okay. So now imagine I had a method that said it was called something like vocalize. Now, by default, animals don't make sounds. Like, I guess what I'm saying is that if I asked you, what sound does animal make? The question doesn't really make any sense. There is no sound an animal makes. But we want to be able to have a vocalize method. So we want to be able to call animal.vocalize and have it do something. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a subclass, or what is called a subclass of animal. And it's going to work is I'm going to have dog. Okay. And then inside of dog, I'm going to def vocalize. And in vocalize, I'm going to write puts bark. We'll say bark says me. Okay. So now I'm going to change animal to dog. So we'll change animal here to dog, change animal here to dog, change animal here to dog. Let's run it. Oh no, there's an error. The error is that dog doesn't have an initializer like animal had. So I could copy this. I could take this and I could bring it down into here. And let's run it again. Bark says me, and now I can actually even change bark says Sparky, right? Bark says Sparky. Okay. Now, something probably felt bad about that, and I think it felt bad too, which is that I had to take this code that is like, all animals have names, or at least we've given them all names. I have to take this code that is common amongst all types of animals, and I had to copy it into another place. And actually, if I went and go create a cat class, I'm going to have to copy this entire thing, create cat. And the only thing that changes about the entire definition is this word meow. So that doesn't feel very good. It doesn't feel good that we have like all these super powerful computers, and I have to copy the definition of this to be this. And also it's not great because if something changes, if let's say I make a change to how name works, or I add some other kind of generic behavior for animals, like maybe animals has fur. Now I have to go add that has fur method to every one of these classes. So there's actually a better way. What I can do instead is I can create a superclass of a certain class. So this class will be generic things that are true for all animals. And then I can actually go in here and I can say dog less than animal. And the way I want you to read that is create dog, which is a subclass of animal, dog subclass animal, or dog is a type of animal. And check it out. By doing that, I can actually remove all of this generic stuff from both of them. And still works. So here's a class. Here's another class that I want to get all of the behavior of that class from. And then I can just use it. And if anyone's wanting to see this, Sphinx, I don't know what to call a cat. Vocalize. Oh, I broke it. Oh, cat. So this is called, yeah, just like people are typing in the chat, this is called inheritance or class inheritance. So it's when one class inherits from another class. Question is, can you do multiple layers of subclasses? For example, a puppy inherits from a dog, which inherits from an animal. Yeah, you can. You can do as many layers of subclasses as you want. The next question is, does it inherit class variables as well? Yes, it does. So these are all things you can try if you're interested. But if you define a class variable, you can call that on any of these. And actually here in this vocalize method, you can do nothing, or in the future, we'll learn how to raise errors. So that could be an interesting thing to do in here too. Okay, is this making sense? Classes, inheritance. You can even go a little bit further than this if you wanted to. So you have dog. Imagine instead of a vocalized method, you had a method called sound. And you changed it to just return bark. And in the cat, it's going to return meow. So now what I can do is I can take this vocalized method. You see, like everything in here would be something you need, or sorry, you already have. So I can go into vocalize and I can actually implement vocalize in a generic way. So I can go like this. Sound says name. Now I can get rid of all my vocalize methods. So that's pretty cool, because what I'm doing now is I'm going from the generic implementation of animals. And I'm saying, since animals all implement the sound method, just get their sound and do the same vocalize method for all of them. So a couple questions. Arreso says, why do you need the empty vocalize method in the animal class? Yeah, the reason that you need it is you don't actually need it. So the question was, for example, in this, I hope you're seeing that answer now. Before I had an empty vocalize method, that'd be the same as here having an empty sound method. I don't have to have it. I just, the way that I got there, had it there. You can't have it there, you don't have to. Luis says, so you call methods from the child class up to the parent class. You're calling methods from the parent class into the child class, but it actually can work either way. So in this case, the parent class is animal and the child class is dog. Sewell says the exclamation after vocalize is part of the name, or is it required? No, it's part of the name. Yeah, so vocalize bang here. Vocalize is just part of the method name, just like a question mark could be. Andrew says, are private methods also inherited? The answer is yes. So for example, in this case, sound, there's no need for sound to be accessible outside. So you can actually just make it private like this. Run it, still works just fine. So not only are, I'll show in a second them being inherited, but not only are they accessible even if they are private, but they're also accessible even if they are private across different parts of the inheritance tree. So I guess another version of that would be if I had something like a private method that said sentence and it returned a string here. And this changed to private sentence. That's still going to work. And even in here, if I wanted to access one of those private methods, that's also still going to work. Everything works. It all works. Everything's fine. Okay. So I saw someone in here talk about the 4 pillars of object-oriented programming. Now, I don't like teaching like that. I like just teaching the thing and teaching like how to use it. But that is kind of a good precursor to something else that I do need to talk about, which is called modules. So there's a problem. There's a problem. There's a couple problems, actually. There's a problem with class inheritance, the way that we've just seen it. I'm going to try to demonstrate what the problem is. Now, imagine you had an animal like we have, and you have a cat, sorry, cat, and you have a dog. And these are both going to inherit from animal. So a cat is an animal and a dog is an animal. So one problem with this, the way that it's written, oh God. Okay, one problem, the way that this is written is that if I wanted to introduce another thing, let's say I wanted to put over here bird. Now, I hope we all agree that bird is an animal, right? But now I want to implement a method called fly. And I want to make it so that fly is only available to the things that can fly. That's going to be pretty hard to do. And actually, that's a lot of times the ways that we end up having multiple inheritance. Having the way that was described, where we have animal, dog, puppy. That you might, instead of putting bird here, you might put something like flying animals. And then underneath that, you would put bird. And you can do that, but there's also a problem with that. And the problem is that now you've defined flying animals. So technically someone just can create a new flying animal, but like, what does it mean to just be a flying animal? It doesn't mean anything more than just being an animal. Another problem is that with doing something like this is that while it might work for this simple example where a bird is a flying animal, imagine you wanted to do something like Scratch. And you wanted Scratch to be available to only the animals that have maybe like claws. So that might not line up directly with the things that you've defined in your hierarchy. So right here, we've defined our hierarchy as like essentially walking animals and flying animals. So that works for things when we're talking about just flying animals and walking animals. But what happens when we talk about something that is not in that same classification of things? Like what if we want to have it so that there's some behavior trying to think of a good example. Some behavior that's like, okay, maybe a good one would be domesticated, right? We've decided to make walking animals and flying animals are two separations. So there's going to be a subclass called walking animals and one called flying animals. Now, if you wanted to have domesticated, you can't, if you wanted to have methods that only existed for domesticated, you can't do that because you only get one class hierarchy, meaning you have animal here, these two things come down from it, and you don't get an opportunity to be a walking animal and also be a domesticated animal. You get to be one thing. You have one superclass. There is no such thing as dog inherits from animal and also inherits from walking animal and also inherits from something else. That is not how inheritance works. The way that inheritance actually works is that you inherit from one thing max. Actually, not even max. You inherit from one thing. Like in the case where I don't write anything here, it's technically you inherit from object, which is like the generic nothing class that sits at the top. So you have to inherit from one thing. You can't inherit from two things. Right, ostrich is a bird, but doesn't fly. So I want to be able to give it bird behaviors, but not give it flying behaviors. So there's a problem and there's a solution in Ruby, and the solution is called modules. So what modules let you do is I can do something like flying animal. And I can define methods like fly. It can be something like puts at name is flying. And then what I can do is I can define a class that is a subclass of animal. This should be bird. Sound is squawk. Okay, so let's make a new bird. Tweety. Bird.vocalize. And I want to be able to call bird.fly. Okay, so bird does not respond to fly. Everything's kind of working, but bird doesn't respond to fly. And it's because we haven't taken our module and include it in here. So if I run that again, you're going to see now that it works. So include is how you take a module and include all of the behaviors and methods that exist inside of that module into individual classes. So now I have two ways to create hierarchies of objects. The first one is these lines, which is called inheritance. The second one is modules, which you can think of as little tiny blocks, something like this, that are essentially defined somewhere and then dropped onto classes. So they're add-on behaviors. These modules are what is called composition. They're included onto an existing class. Okay. Felipe says, is this called taxonomy? Yes. It's funny because it's like we're talking about animals. Animals are the perfect thing to talk about with object-oriented programming because they inherit from each other in a very a way that people know about. Julianne says, why use bang in the method over not bang? There's no reason. It's just to be fun in this case, although typically when people are using bang over not bang, they're doing it to indicate that the method is saving something or that the method has a case where it can throw an error. We'll talk about more of that when we're into Rails too. And Pasan says, so modules don't care about the hierarchy. That is absolutely correct. Modules do not care about the hierarchy. They're essentially, you can think of like a bag of methods. A bag of methods that I'll post this into Slack, yes. They are a bag of methods that you can call from anywhere where you have included the module. I'm going to post it into general on Slack, just so that everyone can copy it if they want to. Okay. Any more questions about this? Okay, I'll keep going on questions for this as long as we want. A lot of times these modules, by the way, are referred to as mix-ins. Okay, so we're mixing in a behavior. Okay, so the next question, modules don't care about the hierarchy. Yes. John, could you please paste the code? Yes. Can a class be called two-legged, which inherits from walking animal class, which is on its own inherit from the animal class? Yes, it can. What I'll tell you is that you could imagine when you're trying to categorize animals, for example, there's a series you can draw many of these hierarchies. I could draw one where walking animals is here and flying animals is here. I could draw one where things that bark is here and things that don't bark is here. I could make any kind of set of hierarchies, and those hierarchies are not necessarily going to line up with each other. They're non-overlapping hierarchies. So what modules let us do is they let us, instead of describing things in terms of inheritance, in terms of what is a form of another thing, they let us describe things in terms of what is the behavior of a thing that has this type? Meaning, in this case, what is the behavior of a flying animal? Well, flying animals fly. I don't need a subclass to implement fly. I can just go and I can bring fly into all the places that I have an animal that flies. So given that, I can use multiple things like flying animal or scratching animal or eating animal or egg laying animal. I can use multiple of those to be able to describe a wide variety of animals that I would not be able to describe with traditional inheritance, because traditional inheritance would place too many limitations on them fitting into a rigid structure like this, which actually most animals don't. Does it make sense? Modules are a way to compose. Compose is the best way to say it. I want you to think of like you're taking something, you're like, okay, this is like a sports car. So I want to almost like bolt on. I want to bolt on the idea that sports cars go fast. I want to bolt on the idea that sports cars have a clutch. I want to bolt on all of these things rather than putting it into an inheritance structure. You're going to understand it more when you use it, but I want you to think of it like this. Composition, composing objects. Okay, Felipe says, is it possible to mention a couple other examples different from animals? Sure. Another one would be like instruments, right? It'd be natural to think that all instruments should fit into either like a woodwind or brass instrument. But actually, instruments have different facets than just whether or not they're woodwind or brass. They might include details about whether or not they are loud or soft, or whether or not they are able to play a certain octave, or whether or not, in the case of something like a bagpipe, they can even play certain notes. Those are behaviors that are different from the hierarchy that you might traditionally define if you just did brass string woodwind. Aloasin says, can you include multiple modules? The answer is absolutely, you can. It can get a little confusing when you have multiple modules about how they interact with each other, but you're going to do it all the time. Hassan says, do the modules get included down in the hierarchy? I believe what you're asking is, are they lower hierarchy than the class? And that is a good point. I'm not going to go too far into it, but the answer is that first things are looked up on the class, then they're looked up on the modules, then they're looked up on the superclass if there is one defined. How is writing modules different than writing a fly method in the bird class? Yeah, so Rajesh, the answer to that involves the idea that there might be other things that fly. For example, an insect flies. So if we were to just write a fly method in the bird class, we're missing the point that we'll now have to duplicate that fly method in both of these places. So we're kind of back to the initial problem again. I'd have to put fly here, and I'd also have to put fly here. Right? So it's the same problem as what we were talking about when we were talking about inheritance, except It's at the next level. It's on modules. Rural says modules are like interfaces. I know what you're saying, but I don't think so, because when people, and feel free to ignore this if you don't know anything about interfaces, but I know other people are asking this question, so I'm going to talk about it. Modules are not like interfaces, because interfaces imply that you conform to a certain set of behaviors, meaning like when you buy in to be part of an interface, you're saying like, I implement these certain behaviors. Modules are not necessarily saying that. So all they're doing is they're taking a group of behaviors and mixing it into the class. I think it's probably safe for you to think of them like interfaces, but they're not exactly the same. They do have a lot of the same properties though. Okay. Oof. A lot of stuff. So we talked about classes, we talked about adder accessor, we talked about inheritance, we talked about modules and mixins. Yeah, I mean, you can define any kind of a instrument. So an instrument that contains 20 different instruments, you can do that. You can represent anything you want in here, but the important thing is that Ruby is giving you the tools to represent it without duplication. So you don't have to write the same methods over and over again if you're implementing a similar behavior in two places. Okay, I'm going to show the homework, and then I am going to sit here and answer questions until there are no more questions. And we do have eight more minutes, so I mean, I'm willing to go over the same thing as long as you'd like, really. Session 5 exercise. You are going to implement a class to store the information about a business. So the initializer should take in the name and location of the business. And then I want you to also implement the ability to get the name and location out of the business. I want you to define a method called hasFood on business, and I want you to make sure that it returns false. Exercise 2, I want you to implement a subclass of business. Let's call it restaurant. And on that subclass, I want you to make hasFood return true. And then the one that you're all gonna be complaining about is exercise 2, which here is listed as exercise 3, but I will fix. Exercise 3 is to use a mixinner module called hasRatings. I want you to add the ability to take in the ratings of a business. So this includes being able to take in a rating, as well as implementing a method on the module, not on the class, called average rating. And that average rating method is going to return the average of all of the ratings that have been added for the business so far. So 1 and 2 here should be pretty easy. 3 might be a little bit more challenging. So, but you have all the pieces that you need to do it. So you have classes, you have modules, you have arrays, and you have methods on array like sum or average, or you can implement your own average if you want. There's always that exercise that's gonna mess you up. And then tomorrow, like I said before, we're going to be getting into Rails. So we're going to take a step back from Ruby. We're going to spend some time talking about what a database is, some basic operations on the database. And hopefully by the end of tomorrow, you'll all be in a good place where you can set up your first Rails app. So it's a big leap that we're about to make. But think about the fact that like everything you've done so far is normally covered in like weeks of time in a traditional class, so even the fact that we've gotten to here is pretty amazing. We've covered a lot of ground, so be proud of yourself if you're here, which you are, because otherwise you wouldn't hear what I was saying. Your brain is stretched. That's good to hear. Yeah, I mean that's how you expand it. You just keep putting stuff in. So I'll stick around as long as people have any questions, but otherwise I think we're pretty good. So Alice says, should we have the homework in by a certain time? If you want it to be eligible for feedback, just try to have it in by like, let's say 1 p.m. my time. Hopefully a lot of you got my messages that I sent. I've sent a lot of you messages with feedback on your your stuff. And also, like, if it's outside the time, if it's later than 1 or something, just send me a DM and I will do my best to look at it. Alice, if you email me, I can verify that yours is showing up correctly. So Eric asks if we can look at def self.create emissions again. I send the feedback via a DM on Slack. So if you're not getting messages from me, there's a chance that either I haven't seen it or you're not pushing it. So figure out which one of those it is. And if you specifically want feedback from me, then just message me and I'll do it. Okay, so we're going to create a class method. We'll call it car, and we'll do self.create emissions. I believe what I wrote in here was at total emissions equals at total emissions plus 1. And it's got to be if not total emissions at total emissions equals 0. And this is important because what it's saying is if it's not defined, set it to 0, and then beyond that, increment it. And then I think what we had was a instance method called vroom. And all it would do is it would say vroom, and it would do self.class.create emissions, which is literally the exact same thing as saying car.create emissions. The only reason why you might prefer self.class over a car is because if you ever change the name of car, this will automatically update. If you wrote car, you would have to change it in both places. Doesn't make a difference. Do whichever one you want. And then the way you would use it is you would do 5 times car.new vroom, and then maybe like 3 times car.new vroom, and then puts car.total emissions, which we would have to define as a class method that would just return total emissions. Boop, done. Hope that makes sense. If you have any more specific questions, let me know. Yeah, I send the feedback via DM. Can you look at the array.max method, most especially the example where the less than equals operator was used? So I haven't taught that operator, but what I will say is I can show you what that operator does, and then I can kind of leave it to you to figure out. The best way to find out what that operator does is to look at the integer definition in Ruby, and you can find it over here. So look what it does. It returns -1, 0, or +1, depending on whether it's less than, equal to, or greater than the numeric. So that's all it does. It's a special named method named less than, equals, greater than, that returns either -1, 0, or 1. Okay, so when they're using that inside of array.max, all they're doing is they're saying return these numbers, and by returning those numbers, they essentially get the max behavior because because of the way that these return. You really are never going to do that. That's not something, it's from the documentation, I realize that, but it's not something you need to know. If you're looking for max of a set of values, you can do max and not pass it a block, and it'll do the thing you want. So just like in that case would be something like 531.max. Always says, does modular mixins take an initializer? No, they don't. They are just a set of methods. That's all they do. There is no initializer. Ruben says, do we keep working on the same file, main.rb, to create different files? It's really up to you. I mean, I'll look at it either way, but it is helpful for me if you organize the files into different directories. A lot of people are doing that. So maybe you have a directory per session, and in there they have like a scratch file where they're writing some stuff. They have a file that they're keeping exercises in, and maybe they have like a file that represents a copy of the assignment that I've given out. Cool. Any other questions I can answer here? Well, okay. Ruben says, can you please show how you create that? Yeah, so go on the left bar here, and when there's a little file with a plus next to it, that's how you create a folder. So you create a folder like that, and then inside of the folder, you can right click the folder and you can click new file. And you can say exercise1.rb, and now you've got a new file that you can type in. And then you'll have to commit that to GitHub. So that's via this part over here. So just like you normally would, just like you've been doing with main.rb, except they're different files. Follow Basin says the max didn't work well for the array of strings. How do you check for a max on an array of strings? Yeah, if you would like to find the max of an array of strings, the easiest way is with a different method that's available on string. It is called max by, and it takes in a string, for each iteration of the block. You return something like the length, and then it will return you the string that has the max length. So this is a way to avoid having to use the less than, equal, greater than operator. Sorry to bring this up, but 01010 gave 520. Kind of want to get to know if that's okay. Yeah, sure, I got nothing else to do, so let's do it. Puts 01010. Let's output that. It says 520. Okay, so if we were thinking about this in binary, what this actually is it's a 2, a 4. So in binary, this is actually 8. So what I'm going to do, just to experiment a little bit, is I'm going to put this into a variable. You see it outputs 520 either way. Okay, so now what we have to do is we have to figure out why puts is doing that. We'll do puts n plus 5, just out of curiosity, 525. Okay, so we're on to something. I know what's happening. When you put a 0 at the beginning of a string, I believe that is, let's figure this out. Let's say Ruby 0 beginning number. We're going to find it. Yeah, I think it might be octal. I'm just looking for something that says that. Actually, I'll just search Ruby octal. Okay, yeah, I think that's the answer why. The answer is because the 0 at the beginning is not binary. Like I said, it's octal. So sorry for the miscommunication there. So basically octal is base 8 instead of base like 16 or something. So that means that each of these positions actually represents 8 bits. So you can think of that like first it's a 0 there, then it's an 8, sorry, then it's an 8 there, then it is not a 16, then it is a 32. Still missing something. Oh, right. Each of these 0, 1, 0, 1. Missing something. Zero. Oh, 0, 8. Oh, right, because this is not so this is the sorry, this is the 0th, the ones position. This is the 8th position. This is the 64th position. This is the 512th position. And this is the 4096 position. So in octal, this is the way that it would work. So if you kind of correspond to each of those to the numbers that they are, you get 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. So then the way you would convert from octal is 512 plus 8, which is equal to 520. So hope that's helpful. That was fun. Thank you for your time. Yeah, thank you for your time. I appreciate all of you being here. Rajesh, I hope that was helpful. I think if you look up the way that you do it in binary, it might involve like putting a B or something somewhere. It's not something that you do often if you're not, unless you're doing a very specific type of programming. And that type of programming is typically not done in Ruby anyway. So that's why I don't teach it. Cool. I will see you all tomorrow. Have a good night.